The 1930s in the Soviet Union was possibly one of the most suppressed times of human history. Under the iron-fisted rule of Joseph Stalin, this era would become known as the Great Terror, and one story which can truly depict the absolute horrors that would happen under the leadership of this man was Cannibal Island. Joseph Stalin was truly a terrible man, the kind that valued his politics more than human life. Even the lives of his very own people, he would happily watch the world around him burn so long as it aligned with his ideologies. And unfortunately for the people under the rule of the Soviet Union, Stalin would have some ambitious ideologies. It all started in 1928, when Stalin was focused at propelling the Soviet Union into the modern age through rapid industrialization and economic transformation. To achieve this, Stalin created new policies and laws in the Soviet Union which would aim at the collectivization of agriculture. These new decrees forced individual landowners into state-enforced farming collectives. Farmers and landowners across the Soviet Union were stripped of their autonomy and placed into vast state-run agricultural enterprises. Of course, many of the people revolted, especially in Ukraine, where the rich fertile soil was home to a large number of farmers who had been farming the land for possibly hundreds of years, and now their simple way of life was being threatened. Some would even burn their crops and kill their animals rather than letting them fall into Soviet hands. But those who defied Stalin's new rules were either shot or sent to forced labor camps, known as the gulags. With the amount of people who protested, and all the political enemies the Soviet Union had at the time, and just criminals in general, meant that there was certainly no shortage of people to be sent to the gulags. And they started popping up all over the Soviet Union. But by 1933, these gulags became so overcrowded that Stalin desperately needed a way to make more room, as he was not quite done with condemning his own people. In March 1933, Genrikh Yagoda, the highest-ranking official in the Soviet secret police, proposed an idea to deport 2 million prisoners to the extremely remote areas of Siberia to work on collective farms. This had already been done before with successful results, and Genrikh was so pleased with his idea that he proceeded with the plans before Stalin signed off on it. A year prior to this, Stalin had reinstated a passport system in major cities such as Moscow and Leningrad. Workers and other people providing important services in these areas were issued with internal passports. This system made it easy to identify unproductive, unwanted, and criminal elements of society. And with the fresh quotas the police now had to hit with Genrich's idea meant that being deported to one of these gulags was incredibly easy to achieve. All you had to do was simply leave your internal passport at home, and if stopped by police you would soon find yourself on a train or barge heading off into the deep Siberian wilderness. Between March and July in 1933, over 85,000 people were deported from Moscow alone. There are stories of countless people who, despite being avid communists, simply forgot to bring their passports out with them. One of these gulags in the Siberian wilderness on the Ob River is known as Nazino Island. The 320 women and 4,500 men who were unfortunate enough to be destined for Nazino Island found themselves on barges, where for 2 weeks they were crammed together and fed only 200 grams of bread per day, if that. But most of the prisoners on board were ordinary working people from the cities who had fell victim to the passport system, and the rest were made up of vagrants, criminals, kulaks, and political prisoners. And so the real criminals that were on board did what criminals do best. They beat up and robbed the bread from as many people as they could. But there was another very real danger on this journey deep into Siberia, and that would be the temperature. Siberia is a place known for its inhospitable temperatures, often reaching as low as -50, and as a result, many people would die on the journey alone from exposure. On May 18, 1933, the barges arrived on the swampy shores of Nazino Island. The island was only 3 kilometers long and barely 600 meters wide. Once all the prisoners were on the island, the guards could no longer be bothered to turn the flour they had brought into bread, and instead gave each prisoner 200 grams of flour, and with the only water available to them being dirty river water, dysentery would soon break out on the island. But the worst was yet to come. There was no shelter anywhere on the island. The plan was that the prisoners would have to build the shelter themselves from the available trees on the island. Except they were given no saws, no hatchets, nothing at all. And as most of the prisoners were city dwellers, they knew very little about cultivating the land and even less about surviving in the wild. Once the guards grew tired of giving every individual person flour, they decided to give the flour to a select few, who would represent a large group and be responsible for distributing it within that group. But almost all of them decided to keep the flour for themselves, leaving thousands with nothing. And it did not take long for violence to become rife and for order to completely break down on the island. The more violent members of the new society formed gangs and took control, exploiting the weaker members. Anything that could be traded for food was taken, which even included ripping gold teeth out of people's mouths. Fights broke out over any scrap of food, and murder became a daily occurrence. The guards were equally violent. They allowed the gangs to operate and even executed prisoners for minor infractions. Many of the prisoners tried to escape on flimsy wooden rafts, but ultimately drowned in the icy waters of the Ob River. Those who did manage to make it to shore were hunted by guards for fun. And for those who were lucky enough to escape, would be unlucky enough to have to deal with the extreme Siberian environments and would be presumed dead. The guards would regularly throw bits of bread into the starving crowds and watch as fights broke out, even shooting at the prisoners from the safety of their boats while getting drunk. And it would not be uncommon for the guards to trade food and cigarettes for sex from the female prisoners. Barely 1 week after being confined to the island, there were reports of cannibalism. News of this was sent back to officials in the closest town, but instead of sending tools or food or anything to aid the situation, they instead sent another 1,000 prisoners onto the island. At this point, the 50 guards finally tried to take action against the cannibalism that was happening, but they were almost powerless to prevent the atrocities. Those who died from accidents, fights, or being shot by the guards were eaten in desperation, but this body count wasn't enough. Roving gangs hunted and murdered for food. They skewered their victims on sticks and roasted them over fires. One grim story from that island is of a woman who had been captured by one of these gangs. They tied her to a tree, and while she was still alive, they began cutting off her breasts, calves, and other bits of her body. She would be found by the guards in the end, but she had lost too much blood and there was nothing they could do. A survivor of the island said that, "I only ate livers and hearts. It was very simple, just like shashlik. We made skewers from willow branches, cut it into pieces, stuck it on the skewers and roasted it over the campfire. I picked those who were not quite living but not yet quite dead. It was obvious that they were about to go, that in a day or two they'd give up, so it was easier for them that way, now, quickly, without suffering for another 2 or 3 days. After 13 weeks of this hell on earth, action was finally taken to close the gulag on Nazino Island, but it was just too late. Out of the 6,700 prisoners that were put on the island, only 2,200 would survive the ordeal. The 50 guards overseeing the island were all jailed for negligence and being complicit in the horror that unfolded. If you did enjoy the video, please consider subscribing, as I'd love to reach 1k. But until the next true disaster, it's goodbye from me.